When people think of chess, they often imagine someone calculating endless variations at warp speed. However, this isn't even close to being true. The ability to do raw, very deep calculations is a talent, which very few have. Fortunately, in many situations, one doesn't need to calculate at all, while in just one or two moves are more than enough in other positions. The great Czechoslovakian grandmaster Richard Reti was asked how many moves ahead he calculated. One answer was 1 move, but it is always the best. Another Reti answer is even more surprising. Those chess lovers who ask me how many moves I usually calculate in advance when making a combination are always astonished when I reply, quite truthfully, as a rule, not a single one. Was Reti joking? Perhaps a bit, but just a bit. Reti was, in a fun manner, stressing the enormous importance of patterns. For example, you've already picked up pins, skewers, forks, decoys, and even the most unpronounceable Zwischenzug. All these are patterns, and as this course continues, you'll be introduced to many more patterns. You might ask, what does calculation have to do with patterns? Reti's point was that by knowing a particular pattern and seeing it on the board during play, he would instantly know what the right move is based on that pattern's needs. Thus, no calculation would be necessary in that situation, or at most, 1 or 2 moves would more than suffice. Here's an example. You're competing in your first online tournament, and you're white versus a Russian, or a Chinese, or a youngster in Alaska. As you study the board, you look at your rook, which is eyeing black's king. Then, in a flash, you suddenly remember our discussion on pins. You understand that his a7 pawn is pinned against the king thanks to the rook and king connection. You see that at the moment, the king has no legal move. And without any calculation at all, you triumphantly grab your knight and thump it onto b6 and its mate. He can't take it with the pawn because of this pinned pawn. And thus we have a 1-move mate. Let's up the complexity a bit. Black seems to be okay here since a7 is protected by the bishop. So everything's kind of cool. However, the bishop's also keeping the knight out of b6. So if you put those two factors together, you can come up with rook takes a7 check, giving away your rook seemingly for nothing. However, after bishop takes a7, the bishop's pinned. It can't move anymore. In a way, it's just like our previous position where this thing on a7 was a pawn. And now b6 is no longer covered because the bishop can't move. And then we get the same mate, knight b6, mate. Solving these two positions required that you recognize 2 patterns you already knew. Once you spotted those patterns, a pin and an immobile enemy king, the solution becomes crystal clear. Calculation wasn't necessary in the first one, and a 1 or 2 move calculation might or might not have been necessary in the second. Once you spot the pin, and once you realize that the enemy king can't move, then any lasting check will be mate. Taking this further, let's look at the next position. This position offers the same basic patterns as the previous 2. And you notice the knight check on b6 is still available, but now black's king has a square to run to. At first, you, quite wisely, decide that checking for checking's sake is silly. The pin along the a file is there, but it doesn't seem to help you. Then again, the pattern suddenly hits you in the face. A fork. You get excited, you grab the knight, knight b6 check, he has to move, and now a family fork, knight d7 check, hitting the king, bishop, and both rooks. And white will win because he'll be a whole rook ahead. So, what is calculation? In general, it's seen an acceptable or ideally a great future outcome, usually based on tactical and/or positional patterns and then calculating a series of moves in the hope of finding a way to safely get there. In this case, white noticed an initial pattern, a pin, and then, after black's forced king move, he noticed another pattern, a fork. A quick calculation verified that it worked. But patterns are what led you to the solution, not calculation. A chess grandmaster has tens of thousands of patterns stored in his head. Some are tactical patterns. Others are all about positional themes. But knowing these things, he's often able to let his hand make the decisions. The brain screams, "Pattern alert," and the hand reaches out and does what it's trained to do by making use of that pattern in some manner. Of course, grandmasters all have the ability to calculate quickly and deeply. And that mix of rapid calculation and pattern recognition is what makes them world-class. But there are only 1,400 grandmasters in the world. That means that the non-professional doesn't need to know that many patterns, nor does he need to calculate like a machine. A few dozen patterns and the ability to look 2 or 3 moves ahead will enable you, after you finish this course, to hold your own against the hundreds of millions of chess fans all over the globe. I'm now going to introduce you to the chess combination, which will be demonstrated by 5 brutal patterns, all of which need a 2 or 3 move calculation. But in each case, if you know the pattern, which you will, the calculation will be either minimal or unnecessary. Here's the late famed chess writer Irving Chernev's emotional explanation of the inner workings of a combination. What is a combination? A combination is a blend of ideas, pins, forks, discovered checks, double attacks, which endow the pieces with magical power. It is a series of staggering blows before the knockout. It is the climactic scene in the play appearing on the board. It is the touch of enchantment that gives life to inanimate pieces. It is all this and more. A combination is the heart of chess. Yes, it's a bit flowery, but that's exactly how most chess players feel when they're able to unleash some magnificent combination. But it's not a real definition. Actually, there are quite a few definitions, most being extremely boring, and some being an agonizing mix of boring and confusing. So let's settle with a combination is a tactical move or series of moves based on the opponent's weakened king, hanging or undefended pieces, or inadequately guarded pieces. Usually involving a sacrifice, it is a calculable series of moves leading to material or positional gains. Notice how that definition strives to point a finger at 2 things that I've mentioned and will continue mentioning: undefended pieces and a vulnerable king. We're now going to learn 3 more tactical patterns, all of them being devastating weapons that need a bit of calculation. We'll start with the clearance sacrifice. Look at this position. White has sacrificed a piece for 2 pawns and an attack against the enemy king. White has 3 attacking pieces in play: the b2 bishop, the queen, and the rook. But how should white make use of them? Take a moment and see if you can spot the solution. Too complicated? Let's move away from this position for a moment and rest our eyes on another very similar position. Here, if I said, what can you do? It's fairly simple. You simply go queen g7, mate. No muss, no fuss. The queen attacks the enemy king. White's queen is protected by this bishop. And there's no way black can escape the check. So game over. Returning to our previous position and armed with the image of black getting mated on g7, which is a very common pattern, try to solve it again. White would love to take his own rook by queen takes g7, which would be mate, but that's illegal. You can't take your own pieces. However, though you can't take your own pieces, you can give them away if they're actually blocking a decisive blow. And this takes us to the clearance sacrifice. The name says everything. White's rook is preventing queen g7 mate. So white wants to clear it out of the way, or if need be, even give it away. White mates in 2 moves. See if you can find it now. The solution is rook h7 check, forcing black's king to take the rook by king takes h7 when queen g7 mate ends the game. A very straightforward calculation. X-ray is next, and it leads to some very surprising and pretty combinations. The name, of course, tells us that it has something to do with looking through another piece. Material is even, and the game would be a draw, except for a nasty trick that black has fallen for. White plays the shocking rook to e8 check, giving away his rook, and trying to decoy the rook away so that the queen will be unprotected. This means that if he does take it, the queen is no longer guarded by that rook. And after queen takes queen, white's going to win because he's won a queen. However, the real point is after rook e8 check, let's say black says, well, I see that, no big deal. I'm just going to move away. I won't fall for your trick. But now we have the X-ray. Rook takes d8, and we're X-raying right through. We've taken the rook, but at the same time, this rook guards his queen. And so we've won a whole rook, the game is over, and it's lights out. Here's another form of X-ray. It's white's move, and he played rook a7. Pretty good move. Notice how it's hitting the bishop, and the bishop can't move because the king would be taken. So it's actually a pin. Black only has one choice. The only way to not lose a bishop in the game is rook to b7. Now he thinks, okay, he'll take me, I'll take back with my rook here, everything's cool. Unfortunately, white uses the other rook. And suddenly we have this X-ray where white's rook X-rays through black's rook and hits his other rook, guarding it. And there's no way that black can protect this bishop. If he takes either rook, he's simply going to take back, and there goes this piece. On the other hand, if he just tries to move the king out of the way, aside from winning a rook, with the, right here, rook takes b7, you can also take the bishop, and because we're X-raying right through there also. After the big move, rook to c7, the game's over. You're winning a whole piece, finito. One final tactical battle is a fan favorite, the windmill. It's actually pretty rare, but once you see it, you'll dream of doing it yourself. Whether you get to play it in a real game or just see it in books, it's still a delightful thing to witness. The pattern isn't about mate, it's about overwhelming greed. The white is a bishop, knight, and pawn behind. Black is dead in the water. Hard to believe. White starts with a check. Notice, by the way, that this bishop at b2 controls this whole diagonal. And so anytime this rook moves, it's going to be a check, an uncovered check against the enemy king. So we start with that. Rook takes bishop, rook takes e7, check. The king can't move up here because if he does, he'd be walking into the rook. So he has no choice. He has to go back to g8. Rook g7, check. We repeat it. It's like lock and load. We're reloading for another check. So he has to step into this line of the bishop, stepping right into the line of the bishop. No choice. As painful as it is, he has to do it. Rook takes d7 check. Once again, he has to go. You reload. Another check. Bang. Here we go again. He has to move there again. Check. Another one. We do it again. Check. Back again. And the poor guy has no choice. He's just watching everything disappear. And now there's no need to check, so we'll just gobble his rook. And suddenly, from being incredibly far behind materially, we have everything. We have a rook and 2 extra pawns. And black really has to just give up and seek some sort of psychological help. The following combination, which might have been impossible to solve if you didn't know the windmill pattern that we just looked at, should now make perfect sense. Even though white has his queen, while black doesn't, black is considerably ahead material. Since bishop takes g7 allows knight takes queen check, something you really don't want to allow, white has to look for something else. And as it turns out, remember that last position again, that last game, the windmill, we simply jump back into this windmill pattern and we give our queen away the way we want to, not the way he wants to with his knight. We go queen takes, rook check, knight takes, bam, and now we're right back to the previous position, locking and loading, back and forth, taking all his pieces, and it won't go well for him. Very quickly, we'll repeat the sequence just for the sheer joy of it. Massive gobbling, and then the final bit of greed, and the game is over. Naturally, combinations can be outrageously deep and beyond the power of mere mortals. That kind of combination is viewed as a work of art and should be enjoyed as any Van Gogh or Hiroshige woodcut is enjoyed. Multiple looks and a feeling of awe. We'll see some of these immortal combinations in future lectures. Fortunately, others aren't as complex, and in time they can be emulated once you acquire enough patterns and experience. Take, for example, a position we looked at in Lecture 4. White played Queen c3, and this wins because you threaten both Queen takes g7 mate, which is pretty terrifying, and Rook takes c8 check. And that's a double attack, nothing can be done about it, and Black would just give up. So, did this just appear magically? Was it just luck? How did it occur? Was White just lucky that the double attack appeared? Or is it the final stroke in some fairly deep combination? Before answering that question, let me tell you a little bit about Bent Larsen, who was White in this game. Bent Larsen was a Danish grandmaster affectionately called the Great Dane, and was, along with Bobby Fischer, the strongest non-Soviet player in the 60s and 70s. He was also one of the finest chess writers who ever lived. I knew Bent and can attest to the fact that he was also a world-class storyteller. Having dinner with him was like taking a course on the secrets of the world's chess elite. He would go on, and you would never want it to end. He was also a very funny guy. One of his favorite lines was, "If your opponent makes a winning combination, it is unfair. If you do it, it's justice." His playing style was different than anyone else's, a dynamic mix of positional and tactical expertise, along with an old-school nose-to-the-grindstone mentality and an amazing imagination. He loved offbeat openings, he was a master of chess psychology, and he always played to win. I was trying to get Bent to write another book when he suddenly died in 2010 at the age of 75. So, was the double attack in Bent's game a stroke of luck? Of course not. He set the whole thing up with a lovely combination. Here's the position right before the combination struck. He sacrifices this knight. You kind of wonder why. It looks crazy. However, the real purpose is he's opening up this diagonal with gain of time and also tearing down Black's kingside pawns a bit. So, Black takes it. But if he does that, that would allow that thing we just looked at, the double attack. Queen c3 threatening the mate, and Rook takes c8. Therefore, he can't take it. And so he noticed that. He didn't fall for it. And so instead, what he does is he says, listen, I can fix this. I'm going to take the rook first. Now, when you take back, I can take the knight because there's no double attack. You no longer have a rook of mine to attack since I've traded them off. Very intelligent. However, Larsen had seen this, and he now gives away his other knight with knight to h6 check. Well, what are you going to do? If you play a move like king h8, just thinking you're going to get out of the way of everything, you run into a very unfortunate end. Bishop takes g7 mate. You notice the bishop is guarded by this knight, and this square is also attacked by the knight. The king has no way out, and it's mate. So he has to take the material. So after knight h6 check, no choice. Forced him to take your piece. Then White comes down, captures this pawn, and threatens a mate on g7. Black starts doing some checks, desperately trying to get away. White moves away, and now there's literally nothing to be done. After something like bishop f6, he's just going to take, and you threaten this mate here on g7. So that doesn't work. And if you try something like bishop f8, you can actually force mate with queen check. Notice that this king is not allowed to move onto either of these squares because of that bishop. And so the poor guy would have to move the piece in the way, and that would be mate. A brilliant win for Bent Larsen. We're now going to explore two king predicaments. The first occurs when someone leaves this king in the center for too long, which is something you never want to do. Get your king castled as quickly as possible. Fortunately, your opponents will often leave their king in the middle, which means you'll be in store for some serious fun. Take a look at this position. Notice how White's king is castled and safely tucked away. Also, notice how White's rooks are able to rush to the center file since the king isn't blocking them. Conversely, Black's king is vulnerable to rook checks down the open D and E files. Also, Black's kingside rook is trapped in a corner. Look at this position for a while and try to get a feel for the vast differences in king safety and rook maneuverability. Now, imagine the horror Black would face if we add more pieces to the equation. Here, Black's going to get routed, since, in effect, his king is taking a nap in the middle of a busy highway. There's many good moves for White, but we're going to start out with queen h5, immediately hitting this key point at f7 and threatening an immediate mate with queen takes f7 mate. By doing this, White doesn't want to give Black time to move his bishop and castle. So you want to start the attack right away while your pieces are ready to jump at him and his king's in the middle. Instantaneous punishment. So he has to guard this point. So he uses his queen, and he goes queen to f6. Notice that if he tried something like g6, stopping that and threatening the queen, he walks into queen e5 check, and there goes a whole rook, more than adequate to win the game. So, back to queen f6. White continues bringing his stuff out rapidly. Bishop g5, a new piece, and now both rooks are connected, and they're going to hit the center and destroy the king. The queen, of course, has to move. You don't want to lose your queen for nothing. Queen g6, hoping to trade queens. You do not want to trade queens in this position. The queen is going to be your big money punch. So after queen g6, we start the bombardment. Rook f e1 check, hitting the king right down that file. The fact is, the king has to run. If he goes bishop e7, it doesn't help. We just take a free bishop. Now we're up a bishop and still have a mating attack. So that's just useless. So he just runs for his life. Then we just keep hitting him. Queen h3 check. So he runs again. Bishop f4 check. He tries to block. Now he's developed and blocked. But we use this pin along the line here, and we play rook e7 check. Can't do it. He cannot take the rook because of this pin along the king. If he tries something like retreating backwards, he walks into a mate, so he doesn't want to do that. So the adventure continues, and he takes a walk on the wild side. King b6. And no mercy, queen b3 check. He moves here to a5. That king does not look very healthy, floating out there. We would really like to play our bishop back to d2 with check, but at the moment he has two pieces that are guarding the b4 square. He could actually block this square with one of them. So what he does first is something quite interesting. He gives away a rook to pull the bishop away from the b4 square. He takes it, bishop to d2 check, nowhere to run, knight b4, and because the bishop is no longer guarding that square, we simply gobble the knight, checkmate. There are two glaring lessons we can take from this. Leaving your king in the center is a very risky proposition. And if your king is safe and your opponent's king is in the center, you need to punish him before he gets his affairs in order and castles. Our next example looks confusing, but this position actually harbors several patterns that you already know: double attack, discovered attack, pin, decoy, fork, and of course, the theme of our present lecture, the central king. Black's king is, appropriately, in the center, which is usually a bad idea. However, Black intends to rectify this problem by playing bishop to e7 and then castling. White wants to punish Black for leaving his king in the middle, so he goes right after his opponent with knight to d5. This sacrifice is based on the discovered attack pattern. Since e takes d5 opens the e file up, attacks the king with the rook, and since the king has to get out of the way, Black's queen had no time to escape the attention of this little pawn, and the pawn would capture the queen. It's basically a double attack. The king's attacked, the queen's attacked. So you can't take the knight. You just lose your queen. So Black saw that, and he said, well, who cares? That knight doesn't threaten anything. So what I'm going to do is simply go bishop e7 and castle, just what I wanted to do. I'm going to stick to what I intended to do and ignore White's crazy moves. And now we have a big move, and the real point of knight d5. Bishop to b5, hitting the queen. It's a pin. You're about to lose your queen. You have to take it. And we've seen this very similar type of thing. Now the c7 square is free, and the knight leaps into c7 with a family fork, hitting the king, rook, and most importantly, the queen. White wins the queen, the game's over. What you just witnessed is a primordial attacking suit with multiple ingredients, all of which you know. Hopefully this example will convince you that even the most complex positions can be solved by a little knowledge. As Reti pointed out, deep calculation, though great if you can do it, isn't a necessity. We'll finish with a very important concept called mating net. The idea is that if you're attacking a king, many players get check fever, which is a disease that makes you want to check the enemy king without caring if the opponent can escape the check. Somehow making a check creates false confidence, so you check the king, and suddenly find that you've chased him to safety. Instead of being check crazy, you need to stop that trigger finger from twitching, and instead see if you are actually gaining anything from checking the enemy king. Often there's nothing to gain at all. If you happen to have an attack, and if you think that a check only helps the enemy king, consider looking for a way to create a mating net, which first cuts off the escape route, leaving the king helpless in the face of the real attack. Here's an example that demonstrates both the successful run of the king and the mating net. In this situation, a lot of people would be really tempted to just start checking. After all, nothing terrible should be happening to Black because there's not many pieces left. Really, White just has a knight and rook, and what's that going to do? So they would just like rook check, yeah. And you feel powerful when you give a check, and another check, and another check, and yet another, and then your checks are gone. And once the checks are gone, it'll be Black's turn. And this pawn right here is going to march all the way down and turn into a queen and win the game. So you don't want to be a victim of check fever. You want to avoid that. So instead, we're doing something called building a mating net. First, you stop the king from running. You look and see how he might run, you block the run, and then you can check, and you're going to mate. And so the correct move was rook to e1. totally dominating the e-file, stopping the king from running into the middle of the board to safety. And unfortunately for black, there's no way to stop mate. After c3, rook check, and rook mate. A very nice pattern. And the game's over. Here's another slightly more complex example. I used a very similar position a while ago, but this one features a mating net. As you can see, black's king is in the center, begging white's army to hurt it. Being a gentleman, white obliges. Rook e1 check. Well, he has to get out of check. He moves his bishop. Now he's hoping to castle. But we don't want him to, so bishop g5. Now we're about to win a piece. You don't want to lose a piece for nothing. And so he has to stop this threat because the bishop and the rook are both attacking it, and the bishop can't capture because there's a pin along the e-file to the king, the rook and king. So he plays f6, blocking that threat. White does not want black to castle. At this point, it's very hard for black to castle since he can't castle kingside because now that bishop line's open, and he can't castle queenside because that diagonal's open. So the king is kind of stuck in the middle, and that's not a good thing. So now white continues the assault. Bishop takes f6, sacking a bishop to rip open the kingside pawns. Well, he has to take it. Notice again, he can't take with the bishop because of this rook pinning along that file. So he takes it with the pawn, and now he's a piece up. And here we have, aside from the whole thing about the king in the middle, we also have another little ingredient, which is building a mating net. White would like to check, but the black king can start running. We don't want that to happen. So the first thing you do is you build a mating net. You prevent him from running to the left by putting your rook on d1 and making the whole d-file persona non grata. So since this big check is threatened, black plays h5, taking that square away from the queen because now this rook guards that pawn. And black is just holding on desperately. And white desperately wants that check, so he goes queen f5. Now he's trying to check here. Black moves his king, avoiding the check. White oozes his way in. Now he threatens queen to f7, mate, because this bishop and the queen are both covering that square. So black moves his bishop. This allows the queen to guard this whole line. And white just gobbles this pawn. Check. This is awful. The king can't move here because the queen's covering it. The king can't move here because the bishop's covering it. The king can't move on the file because the rook's covering it. And so all he has left is the hideous queen f7, which allows the mate. Queen takes f7, mate. We've gone over a lot of information, and you'll find that many of these patterns will appear in your own games, but it will take time and practice for you to notice them. If you play games at home or on the web, and I highly recommend that you do so, and if you think one of these attacking patterns can be created or used in some way, please give it a shot. You'll be absolutely delighted if you manage to replicate the things we've discussed. And if your game falls apart and the dreamed of mating net is a bust, shrug your shoulders, do your best to figure out what went wrong, and then try again next time.